Hello and welcome to another NCGP Live conversation, informative conversations about general practice in Nottingham City. I'm Dr Andy Foster and today I'm joined by Dr Alastair McLauchlan. Hello Alastair, hi.
Good morning, hi.
Good, and today we're going to be exploring the challenges and opportunities faced by the profession due to changes in how GPs expect to work going forwards. There's been a reduction in the interest in the partnership model, for example, and that poses all sorts of problems for GP practices and the system at large, and people are trying to find solutions to this. So we'll be talking about some of the solutions and the thinking that's been developed around this issue in Nottingham City. NCGPA is a federation with a membership of over 40 practices in Nottingham City, and we hope that these NCGPA live conversations will be of interest to local practices, people working in primary care in the local area, and also people interested in primary care more widely, or with a wider interest in primary care networks or GP federations. We're aiming to have a fairly free-flowing conversation, podcast style, so hopefully this will be entertaining as well as informative, and people can sit back, continue to drive your car, do your ironing, run on the treadmill, and hopefully enjoy and be informed by our conversation. So without further ado, Alastair, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Alastair McLauchlan. I've been a GP for many years, having started in my father's old practice opposite the City Hospital in 1983, so quite a long time ago. And during that time I've been a GP foremost, but a few things have taken me off in different directions as I've been interested in them, and the main one of those was GP education and workforce, I suppose. So I was involved in the GP training scheme, worked for the Deanery, for HEE, Health Education England, and more recently with the CCG, then moved into working, helping develop the Phoenix programme in Nottingham City, which is a workforce plan for GPs initially, and then more recently as working as professional advisor for NCGPA.
Oh, fantastic. And just for clarity and everyone out there, so I'm Dr Andy Foster. I'm an NCGPA board member, acting deputy clinical director of PCN1, one of the local primary care networks, and I'm a GP partner in the area. And I've been around for 10 years, so nowhere near as long as Alastair has been around. And Alastair, the first contact I had with you was seeing you as what I considered at that stage one of the sort of big beasts of local general practice at CCG meetings and so forth. And one of the things I always remember about you is you always have a quiz, Alastair.
I do.
So I love that. It's one of your characteristics sorts of things. So well, let's get into talk about this. So I know sort of some of the things that you've been involved in more recently have been around having contact with younger, newer GPs to practice, and starting to think about how they are wanting to work and how they are wanting to live their careers and their lives, really. And I get a sense that things have been changing. I think we all have. So what are they saying to you about their careers?
So obviously, if you've been in the system quite a long time, you've met a lot of people at different stages. And because I was involved in a GP training scheme and education, I had access to chatting to people who were younger than myself. So a lot of things, and there was a view really that it was difficult to recruit into general practice in the same way that we could have done maybe 20 years ago, when general practice was a very, very attractive and model, and GPs were very keen to, or doctors were very keen to be a partner in general practice. That had changed, and anybody who's been in practice looking for a new partner realised that there's not so many applicants for jobs, so clearly something was happening. So more recently, with informal conversations initially, it became clear that people finishing their training scheme often didn't feel quite ready to go into what they thought would be a lifelong career as a GP partner. So that led me to thinking maybe 10, 15 years ago about a sort of bridging scheme, which is sort of which became the GP fellowship scheme, which was a national scheme which gave people the opportunity to do some education-y type stuff as well as general practice in their early first couple of years. So that was the first piece of work that I did.
Fantastic. And also, what are people saying? So there's a reduction in interest in the partnership model. What are the new GPs actually saying? Why is it less attractive to them? What are they saying to you?
Well, so we did something revolutionary. So at the stage I left the CCG about 4 years ago, we the LMC were interested in workforce, and they asked me to chat to them and chat to other people about what we could do. So what I did was I, along with other people, worked to interview some of the local SD3s, so the final year GPs, to find out what they actually wanted, how it had been for them up to there, and what they wanted in the future. And though this doesn't sound terribly revolutionary, nobody ever actually bothered asking them before. And so what we found was 3 things really. Firstly, that those doctors, although they had quite a lot of training, hadn't had quite the number of patient contacts that we had in early training schemes, so they didn't feel ready to go straight into practice. That's hence the reason why they often went into locums first. They didn't really know what they wanted. So that was the first thing. The second thing was that they were quite keen to try more than one practice. So again, locums work for that, but also the idea of a rotation in some ways was born then, the idea of working in more than one practice at an early stage to see what you actually liked. The third thing was that they weren't really confident enough, I think, they wanted more support. I think that we were often like little baby birds chucked out the nest. They didn't really want any of that, and there's a good reason for that, I think. But they wanted a bit of mentoring. And that's important. And the final thing was that what they also wanted was to develop more. So there was a view that almost when you went into practice as a partner, you didn't always develop and learn more things. So this wasn't necessarily about a portfolio style career, but it was about developing expertise in an area. And the areas that we sort of worked out after a while were specific clinical areas. Clearly that was interesting to them. That was the first thing. The second thing was teaching. A lot of them were very interested in teaching, which is actually really positive now because of the new workforce roles. And the third thing was leadership. There's been a sort of massive explosion of leadership or potential leadership jobs. So that's what we learned. And that led, at that stage, we developed the Phoenix program, and we basically used those findings to develop what we did.
Yeah, fantastic. And I'm going to ask you a bit more about fellowships in a little while. I was just hoping to just explore the problems created by these changing expectations in the workforce, particularly that reduction in interest in the partnership model and being partners, and what problems that creates for the system. We spend a lot of time thinking about this, but some of those might not be apparent to people listening to the podcast. So what are those sort of problems or risks for the system in your view, Alastair?
So I think what you have to understand is the traditional partnership model still works well in certain areas, but doesn't work quite so well in others. So I think because we're Nottingham City GPs, I think it'd be fair to say that areas, more inner city areas, but certainly in our area, the people don't necessarily want a traditional partnership role because they perceive it to be too hard, too challenging, and too demanding in lots of ways. So that this is a trend that's been happening not just across medicine, I think, and it's something about controlling your workload, which is an entirely reasonable view. So the problem with that is that so we've got that on one side. The other side is that traditional practices still need to provide care for all their patients, whatever their need is, within the time frame that they are open and available. And clearly, controlling your workload in one area, but having that open-ended commitment means that there's potential conflict.
Absolutely. And I guess a tension that I perceive, and often perhaps not correctly described as a difference between newer GPs and older, more established GPs. I don't think that's quite the right way to characterize this, because I think it's more individual than that. But there are some people who will say, well, my work-life balance is really, really important. You know, I'm contracted to work a certain amount and I work over that anyway, and I don't feel it's appropriate that I do additional work over and above that without that being properly resourced and acknowledged. And that does sound very reasonable. And then there are other people who say, well, general practice is a profession and there are professional responsibilities that trump my responsibilities to myself at certain times. And if there is something that is not finished at the end of the day that needs finishing, or even at the end of the week or the end of the month, then it is my responsibility to stay and do that. Even with that coming out of my mouth, it sounds old-fashioned, hearing the words in a way, but there's a tension there. Do you think that's a real tension, and how do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, you're right. There's a massive tension, and I describe it really. I think that for example, the BMA salary contract model is a very well-written document that allows people to control their workload in very precise terms. The challenge is that doesn't work for the overall needs of the whole population that a general practice serves. And there is this thing called professional integrity, and it's what we all sign up to when you go into a profession, and certainly into the medical profession, that that some things will take, on occasions, be very inconvenient for you and take longer than you think and will require more of you. So it's that conflict that has to be resolved in people's minds. Equally, it's completely unreasonable to expect people to work consistently beyond what they're being resourced for. That isn't fair. I mean, that just isn't fair. So it's more nuanced than just saying one side's right and the other side's wrong. It's much more nuanced than that. And I think, just starting to finish that point, I think that this has been made worse, I think, because of all the challenges that external challenges, COVID, etc., that have happened over the last few years, that everyone's feeling very bruised by it all, understandably.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Alastair. And I was just developing my thinking as you were talking, and an example might be helpful. I guess people would say, well, if there is a backlog in pathology results that needs processing at the practice before the weekend, then you've got a professional responsibility to stay late and do that, and that's what a lot of salaried GPs as well as partners will do. But that becomes different, I think, if because of the way the system is set up, every Friday people have to do unfunded work to clear that backlog, and I guess that's where it starts to feel unreasonable. I just feel that's often the battleground where these tensions are. And it was interesting you said it about whether you're asked to do that consistently, and I think that's actually quite an important word.
Yeah, I think it's important to realise as well that sometimes medicine has been slow to evolve, and I think if you looked at general practice 10 years ago, it looked exactly the same as when I went into it 30 years before that. So it sometimes is a bit traditional and needs to get new ideas and new ways of thinking and challenges. And I think it's okay. I think it's good to challenge and to change things. So you're absolutely right. Why do things have to be done a certain way? And the answer is not because it's always been done that way. So I think when you're looking in the future about how you change things, you've got to develop all the time to recognise what's going on. We know, for example, that the workload and the complexity of consultations is much, much more than it was 5, 10, 30 years ago. So there has to be changes to recognise that. And I think that's all we're saying, and that's all the new generation is. And just on that point, the new doctors, it's not just doctors, but new entrants to primary care are just as enthusiastic as we were when we went into general practice. So this isn't an old versus new split. It's completely not. They're just as enthusiastic. They perhaps are just asking the questions that we ought to be asking now.
Yeah, there's also a sense that people like yourself and I have perhaps been boiling frogs in a profession that's come under increasing pressure. And actually, when we first started and we were feeling fresh, probably the situation wasn't quite as pressured as it is now. It may not be a generational thing. It may just be that they are people fresh, and it's actually a reasonable response to water that's quite hot. It's just that it's got hot while we've been in it, so we don't notice quite so much how ridiculous the situation has become. But getting a bit philosophical there, one of the big things that you've been involved in, Alastair, as part of the response to this problem and supporting new GPs is the development of the fellowship scheme. And I was hoping you might be able to tell us a bit about how that started, and then how that's evolved over time.
So as I mentioned at the beginning, the National Health Education England Fellowship Scheme was a very targeted, very limited option for some people who wanted to do a bit extra educationally as well as general practice when they first started. That was separate, and then it got reduced in funding. And at the same time in Nottingham, we started the Phoenix programme, and the Phoenix programme was recognising those questions that the new GPs were asking us. They wanted to learn more. They wanted to do this, that, and the other. So because we had some money which was left over from an underused pot in HEE, we managed to offer access to training for doctors that want to do something else. So it might be a dermatology or diploma in dermatology. It might be doing extra minor surgery training. But we were lucky enough to have the money, and it was really about developing the individual rather than the need they had. And I think as time has gone on, since the Phoenix programme has moved on a pace, there's a recognition that you have to align the professional desires of people with the population health needs. And indeed, that's what the whole PCN network stuff's all about. And I think we've managed to do that. So that's what we've been doing.
It's fantastic.
Sorry, if you wanted, I can talk for hours, as you probably know. So it started off with younger doctors. It's moved into mid-career doctors, which is doctors who've been in practice for more than 5 years, and then to senior careers and senior fellows. And it started off with GPs because that's where the money came from originally. But the idea, the principles behind it all, is for every person in the workforce in primary care to have the opportunity for professional development, but it must be aligned to patient need as well.
Absolutely. And I know we've benefited from having some fellows at my practice over time. Actually, we practice in what might be regarded as a challenging area. It had been difficult to recruit, and it seems to have been a big help actually to getting quality people who are interested in developing themselves and in continuing their education and learning into practices like mine and neighbouring practices in difficult areas. So it's been a big help actually, not just for the fellows I think, but for GP practices who've been able to also take advantage of it as well.
So actually on that business, on the subject of challenging areas or areas in underserved or deprived neighbourhoods, one of the big developments over the last 3 or 4 years has been the Trailblazers fellows, which is a specific part of the new to practice scheme. Well, it's allied to it, it's not actually part of it. So these are people who actually want to work in practices which have a high index of multiple deprivation or have a significant need. And it's been very positive, and the evaluation's been really, really positive as well. And in Nottingham, interestingly, the first cohort of 5 Trailblazers 2 years ago, 4 of them are still working in practices which have a high index of multiple deprivation, which is the findings nationally from Humberside and Yorkshire.
Oh, fantastic. And it's also been really good to see mid-career and late career fellowships becoming available as well. Have you got anything to say about those? What type of work those fellows are doing in terms of project work? I'm not as close to it as I was. The schemes are run under the auspices of Jen Wilkinson and her teams, who have done fabulous jobs, actually, fabulous development since I left. But the mid-career was a recognition that there are a number of people just who have been in practice for more than a couple of years who are ready then to look at other areas, and they're now focused on. Each PCN had the opportunity to have a mid-career
fellow, which gave them a funded session about a week to look at an area that's relevant to their PCN, which is also relevant to them. So that's where it's aligned with patient need plus their interest. So that's the first thing, which has been really positive. And the final bit was the senior fellow, which I've had a sort of, I would have, wouldn't I, a bit of an interest in this area. And that's because if you look at some of the research about people who are leaving practice, a lot of GPs, although they may be a little bit tired of the day-to-day stuff, actually have a massive passion for general practice itself and for medicine, and wanted to give back some of the wisdom that they'd learned, but they didn't want the day-to-day grind at that stage in their career. And what we started developing has now been progressed more is the idea of senior fellowships, and this is a really interesting scheme which allows people, and it often works with the new to practice fellowship, which is a government scheme now, which allows the mentoring, which we talked about earlier, to be given to those younger doctors who wanted a little bit of support, but were outside their own practice support. So part of senior fellowship is that, but it could be also a clinical area, or it could be more leadership. So, and in NCGPA itself, we've been lucky enough to have the opportunity of senior fellows who have been doing some work on the salaried partnership model we've looked at, also in developing clinical leaders, maybe looking at how you mentor the new workforce, the hours workforce. So there's all sorts of opportunities for people to actually give their wisdom back into the system.
Yeah, I think fellowships has been a really welcome innovation, Alastair. One of the challenges that people out there sometimes make, or that I sometimes hear around fellowships, is that you may be taking GPs who might have worked 7, 8, 9 clinical sessions with patient contact, and you're incentivizing them to reduce the patient contact and do other things with their time that isn't seeing patients at a time when it's difficult for GPs. It's difficult for GP practices to find people to do clinical sessions, and it's difficult for patients to see a GP. What's the sort of defence to that, or the answer to that?
Well, I think the answer to that is that they weren't going to do more clinical sessions. They just weren't. And in fact, the reason a lot of the workforce things have started is because a lot of people were going to leave general practice. So we know that they did some evaluation, I think it was in 2019, and there was something like 19% of GP trainees were considering leaving medicine altogether. So it's 2017. So that was the first thing. So that they wouldn't do any use at all. And a lot of the GPs were going to planning to retire earlier. So the senior fellowship particularly has kept those people working that were definitely going to retire. The younger ones were going to reduce. And what we've actually got, so the local scheme, the Phoenix Programme evaluation, has come up with evidence that say that people are working more than they were going to do because of the enthusiasm and the opportunities they've had up to now. So they would have been lost to the system, and now they're still in the system and developing expertise. So I don't think that's true. And the interesting stuff is the most recent stuff, which I have from the Phoenix Programme, showing that in the Nottinghamshire area, the number of full-time equivalent GPs has actually increased since the Phoenix Programme has gone by something like, well, not by a vast amount, but 685 up to 717. So reasonable amount. And on your point about partners, the number of partners has gone down by about 50, but the number of salaries has gone up by more than 50. So yeah, we know this is a trend that's happening in Nottinghamshire, and we know that they are not being lost to the system because that's full-time equivalents.
Yeah, it's good to have some data and information to show that GP numbers have increased since the fellowship's been in place. And I would say actually, whilst I might have entertained some of those challenges a few years ago, my actual experience of seeing the fellowship scheme in action is that actually I've seen more high quality younger GPs working in my practice and other neighbouring practices, and I have seen certain individuals who we won't name in the show, but who would have retired, who are now actually retained doing useful work supporting colleagues in general practice. So actually I think the reality is that it's been beneficial from my perspective. Alastair, we were beginning to touch upon another area which I think is important to talk about, and that is that as GPs perhaps become less interested in the partnership model, in a model of delivering care that actually relies on there being some partners in the system to keep practices going, a number of practices can and have run into problems with succession planning, which has threatened their sustainability. And actually, we've seen some practice failures in the area because of an inability to recruit new partners. That's led to some federations, both locally and I'm sure up and down the country, being asked to take on a direct management role of GPs, and that sort of produced an entirely salaried model across individual or some groups of practices in Nottingham City and the area. And I know that you've been involved in looking at that with NCGPA, and I'm just wondering what challenges organisations dealing with an entirely salaried model are finding, in your opinion.
Right. So this is the nub of the problem, isn't it? Really. So these observations come from initially some thoughts, but also now from reality of actually being involved with NCGPAL and some of the practices that they have helped support over the last 2 or 3 years. So we know that a GP's job is very all-encompassing, and we know that the traditional model, the slack, was taken up by the partners a lot of the time. However, we also know that in a salaried model, you have a contractual, you've worked to a contract that sort of controls your workload, as we discussed. Now, one of the problems is that something we know now, we can observe it, that there are gaps in those systems, and those gaps in the past were usually done by the partners. However, some of the gaps were clinical, some of the gaps were administrative, really. Some of the gaps were leadership, and what you have to recognise is that general practice is changing and needs to change in lots of ways. So there's no reason why you can't have a predominantly salaried model as long as those gaps are filled. Remember that, again, the concept that the practice, or maybe the PCN, has a responsibility to those patients within the hours that it's open for everything. So it can't just say, I'm not doing it, there isn't a surgery that day. Someone has to do it somewhere. So if you just think about the admin stuff for a second, there's no reason why clinicians always have to be involved in that, and they don't even have to. The admin doesn't even have to be done within one practice. So you can have economies of scale having more than one practice. The federation looked after them. So that's fairly simple. As is things like estates or maybe HR. These things can be done by experts in larger, for larger groups of people. The clinical area is interesting. The first thing to say is, at the same time as this, one of the practices, or all the practices are under challenge, is that we've got this completely new workforce that's being developed. So the R's workforce, so the pharmacists, the physios, the physician assistants, all these new groups of people who are doing a fantastic job, I have to say. And the thing about that is that what we know is that in certain areas, let's use musculoskeletal, maybe 30% of consultations have some musculoskeletal element. Now, in the past, people were booked into the GP. Is the GP the right person to see them? Not always. So physios, we know that physios have better outcomes with patients with acute back pain, maybe shoulder injuries, lots of things that they can do where the patient gets a better service for seeing a non-doctor, and therefore that doctor is more freed up and the nurse is more freed up to be able to see others, basically, that their skills are most useful for. So that's the first thing. You can use a different workforce to actually take some of the clinical work off. But the other part of the clinical stuff is, and where the traditional partners used to do it, is the overview of management. So if, for example, let's use cough as an example. If you had respiratory disease in cough, then often you used to have one of the clinicians, not always a doctor actually, maybe it shouldn't be a doctor, could be the person that sort of kept an overview, didn't do it all, but kept an overview to make sure that that was absolutely up to date. Well, there's no reason why a salaried doctor shouldn't do that, and any more than they do their normal consultation. So we've got boxed into a corner about the concept that salaried doctors do sessional things, and in that session they do a fixed number of consultations and do this, that, and the other. What we need to have is a broader thing which gives them the opportunity to be involved in more leadership clinical areas than just seeing people with a consultation. And indeed, that's what the evidence, when we've asked people what they want to do, that's what they want to do. And the big thing about the NCGPA in developing this is that if you work with population health, which is the whole point about PCNs, then you determine what needs to be done for your population. By doing that, those people within those PCNs can develop the skills and the abilities to take the quality of care upwards, which will improve their professional self-esteem and abilities, but also improve patient care. So it's about the alignment of those things, and that can be done in a salaried model.
And I suppose one of the things which I think people hear from new GPs is that it's not that they're not interested in developing those leadership skills or more specific clinical skills. They do want that development, and I guess within a salaried model, such as that being developed by NCGPA, there's an opportunity to offer them a career pathway with progression. Is that a concept that's being fleshed out, Alastair?
That's exactly what we're trying to do. That's exactly what we're trying to do. I mean, as always, the best innovations always come from the bottom up. So we're trying to encourage people to think get the information they need from public health, so population health management. They need to think critically about how that care is provided within their own practice or PCN, and then they need to work out who might be interested in taking that further, and then we can help with supporting that process educationally and professionally.
Yeah. So, Alastair, so I work obviously within NCGPA, but I'm also a GP partner working for a practice that is it's a member of NCGPA, but it's not organisationally linked in terms of its day-to-day operations. And what another potential criticism that I hear out there is that people may feel threatened in some way by the development of a salaried model within NCGPA that feels very different from what they are doing as GP partners, trying to maintain a partnership model. And I'm just wondering how you feel about that difference, and should people feel threatened? Should they feel supported by it because it supports the system in general? What's your thoughts on that tension?
They certainly shouldn't feel threatened. I mean, the only reason that the salaried model is being developed is because that's what a lot of the young doctors coming out of training schemes have said they wanted. So it's actually to make sure there is a workforce that are getting what they want within the system. So they certainly shouldn't feel threatened. The idea is not to develop a salaried service for NCGPA practices that is in some way a rival. It's to support primary care within Nottingham City, which has a problem with has had a problem with recruitment and retention, but is now that's being turned around. So it's the opposite. It's actually offering a solution to those practices who couldn't find a solution for themselves. And we're always keen to share all the findings of the work that we've done and the elements that seem to be successful with anybody who asks, to be honest. So it's the opposite. And I don't think the partnership model is dead. I just think it's not very well in certain areas, and inner cities being one of them. It works particularly well in other areas. So this is not about trying to enforce a new system on an unwilling system that wants to continue. It's an alternative for those people that want it. And it can live very happily side by side.
Yeah, and I think it's an evolving model and it's an evolving situation across the city. And I'd like to think actually in the future that some GPs who perhaps start their career as salaried GPs in NCGPA practice might develop leadership interests, develop their skill sets, and then actually move outside of NCGPA and be a partner, at a practice, because they may have the desire to do that and have that level of control and influence on where they work. And I think that would be a really, really healthy thing to happen.
Well, I think that is already. I've had conversations with people who are already wanting to have options to do that, and I think that the best systems allow all options, not just an enforced one. So this is the response which works for some practices within certain areas, but it's not the only one, and it should be a hybrid model, shouldn't it?
And another dimension which we've not talked about so far is one of the reasons I think partnership can be unattractive to new GPs at the moment is because they can perceive quite a lot of risk or liability in partnerships, because they see partnerships sometimes failing, and it's difficult to be one of the last partners in a partnership that is struggling. It places a lot of pressure on people, and there are potential liabilities there. And I think that's part of why the model is unpopular. And I think in a certain way, by providing an option for partners to exit and have a soft landing with NCGPA or other federation organisations or other organisations being there and strong enough to sort of step in and take things on and ease that exit, in a certain way, I think that actually makes those partnership roles more attractive, because people know that they're not going to struggle to escape, if it actually comes to that. So actually, in a certain way, that could actually support the system, I think, and we might end up a few years down the line with a much healthier system where partnerships are easier to get out of as well as get into, and we might have some travel of people moving from NCGPA roles up and through the system and into the partnerships. So I'm optimistic that we may move through this difficult period as relates to attitudes towards partnership.
Well, I'd agree, and I think it's to the credit of federations, NCGPA in particular, that they've taken on the mantle of practices that have struggled with that, and it is a massive responsibility, feeling that you're the last person standing, and that it all falls with you. And what this work is doing is showing what work needs to be done in addition to just a consultation. That's exactly the point, and that's why it's really key. Because once we can work that out, you can work out proper resources and proper systems in place that may require economies of scale, as we talked about before, HR, estates, that could be done and never needs to touch a clinician's mind at all. So I don't see why. I think this is the best thing that could have happened to general practice, traditional general practice, as well as salaried service, to be honest.
So Alastair, coming towards the end of our conversation, and I know that you've been around for longer than I have, and maybe longer than a lot of people who are watching or listening to this conversation. It feels like general practice is in a bit of a dark place at the moment. That's the way it feels. That's the way people are talking. You've seen a lot of changes over your time. Does that leave you with anything encouraging to say to people out there, or is this really the end? What would you say to people out there? Wisdom.
It's definitely not the end. It's definitely I think it's an important time, and I think it's an important time to for all of us to reflect on quite what we want out of our primary care services. But I think this is the perfect time to renew primary care. Yeah, primary care is absolutely vital for the health service. If a strong primary care keeps, we all know the figures, 90-95% of consultations are in primary care rather than secondary care. We know that if we can deal with things at an earlier stage, then health outcomes are much better. It's a really, really, it's a fabulous part of the health service, and it's got its challenges, but it's exactly that times of challenge where you find solutions that actually improve things. And without challenge, we wouldn't have perhaps looked at things that we need to look at. It's been very slow in changing primary care, but it needs to change now, and there are opportunities to change, and that's what we should be doing.
Thanks, Alastair. I think that feels like a healthy attitude towards me, and it's there's often a lack of optimism in the general conversations about general practice. So I think it's really healthy to hear that message.
Andy, if you talk to people who are going into the health service generally, when they're 18 and 19, they're usually fairly sparkly-eyed, really positive about it. They're just as sparkly-eyed and positive about it as we were when we went into it. So we just need to recognise that we need to do things to improve it, but everybody's still keen to do it.
Yeah, oh, fantastic. So Alastair, as we wind things up, I just want to thank you for taking the time to talk to me. It's been really fantastic to get the benefit of your wisdom and the things that you continue to be involved in and drive forward. I think we're very fortunate to have you on our patch in Nottingham, and thanks very much for talking to me today. Final question, Alastair. So people have spent the time, hopefully they're still with us, 40 minutes listening to our conversation. Do you have any call to action or anything that you think people could do next if they want to learn more or take some action? What would you suggest people do?
Well, I think they should be confident that things are happening in our local area. I think that obviously everybody at NCGPA would be very happy to chat, and certainly I would, to chat to people if they're interested in this. There are the other workforce schemes, so the Phoenix programme, as I mentioned previously, but the training hub have got importance in education. I think that you need to reflect on your own situation and where you are. And if you've got any thoughts or process or desires to change things or to influence things, just get in touch, and I'll be very happy to speak to you.
Yeah, fantastic. And I'll just bring some contact details onto the screen. But if people are listening, they can contact NCGPA on Twitter at NCGPA NOTTM. So at NCGPA Nottingham, or they can visit the NCGPA website, www.ncgpa.org.uk. I think there's a contact us page that people can use, or I guess they can approach Alastair directly or myself even. And if people have any other suggestions about topics that they'd like to see discussed, conversations that they feel need to happen about general practice in Nottingham, then please get in touch and make those suggestions. And finally, thank you very much for staying with us throughout the conversation, and thanks again to Alastair. Thank you.
Absolute pleasure.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.